The aircraft carrier USS Hornet pitched violently in the North Pacific swells as Lieutenant Commander Kestrel Maddox gripped the controls of his North American B-25 Mitchell bomber. The morning of April 18, 1942 had arrived gray and unforgiving, with salt spray whipping across the flight deck 600 miles from the Japanese coast. His hands trembled not from fear, but from the impossible mathematics of what they were attempting. No twin-engine bomber had ever launched from a carrier deck. No mission had ever demanded such precision with so little margin for error. The runway beneath his wheels measured only 467 feet, while his fully loaded Mitchell needed at least 1,200 feet under normal circumstances. As the deck officer raised his checkered flag, Maddox felt his heartbeat synchronize with the thunderous Pratt and Whitney engines. He was about to disobey every principle of safe aviation ever written, leading 15 other bombers in an act of calculated madness that would either shatter Japanese confidence forever or vanish into the Pacific without a trace. The radio crackled with static as Admiral William Halsey's final message echoed through his headphones, "Launch the Army and God bless you." Maddox released the brakes, feeling 26,000 pounds of steel and high explosives surge forward into history. No one aboard the Hornet that morning knew that 16 men's defiance of aeronautical impossibility would rewrite the entire strategic landscape of the Pacific War. Kestrel Maddox had grown up in the wheat fields of Kansas, where the horizon stretched endlessly in every direction and the sky seemed large enough to hold any dream. Born in Dodge City in 1917, he was the son of a railroad engineer who believed in precision, punctuality, and the unforgiving consequences of mechanical failure. His father, Jeremiah Maddox, had taught him that machines were honest partners that rewarded careful attention and punished carelessness with absolute finality. During the endless summers of the 1930s, young Kestrel had built model airplanes with obsessive attention to weight distribution and balance, dreaming of the day he might pilot real aircraft through the boundless Kansas sky. His mother, Adelaide, watched her son's fascination with flight, with equal measures of pride and concern, knowing that his restless intelligence would eventually carry him far from the safety of their small farming community. When he graduated from high school in 1935, Kestrel possessed an intuitive understanding of aerodynamics that impressed his instructors at the local flying club, where he worked weekends cleaning hangars in exchange for flight lessons. The old barnstormers who taught him noticed something unusual in the young man's approach to flying. While other students focused on following procedures, Maddox seemed to sense what an aircraft wanted to do before the instruments told him. He could feel turbulence in his bones and predict engine trouble by the subtle changes in vibration through the control stick. This instinctive connection with machinery would serve him well in the crucible of military aviation, where split-second decisions meant the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. After Pearl Harbor transformed America's isolationist dreams into a desperate fight for survival, Maddox enlisted immediately, driven by a quiet fury that surprised even his pacifist mother. His instructors at flight school quickly recognized his exceptional abilities, promoting him rapidly through the ranks of bomber pilots who would soon carry the war to Japan's doorstep. The concept of striking the Japanese mainland had consumed American military planners since December 7, 1941, when the surprise attack on Pearl Harbor demonstrated Japan's ability to project power across vast oceanic distances. President Franklin Roosevelt had publicly demanded retaliation against the Japanese homeland, but the strategic reality seemed to make such an attack impossible. Japan's island fortress lay thousands of miles from any American airbase, protected by an impenetrable ring of defensive positions that had taken decades to construct. Traditional bombing raids required airfields within range of the target, yet every airstrip capable of supporting heavy bombers remained firmly under Japanese control. The Navy's aircraft carriers could approach closer to Japan, but their fighter planes and dive bombers lacked the range to reach Tokyo and return safely to their ships. Meanwhile, the Army's long-range bombers possessed the firepower and endurance for such a mission, but their weight and wingspan made carrier operations impossible under conventional circumstances. This strategic impasse frustrated American commanders who desperately needed to demonstrate that Japan's seemingly invincible military machine could be challenged on its home territory. The psychological impact of such a raid would far exceed its tactical significance, proving to both Japanese civilians and American allies that the empire of the rising sun was not beyond the reach of American air power. Into this impossible equation stepped Lieutenant Colonel James Doolittle, a brilliant pilot and engineer who had spent decades pushing the boundaries of what aircraft could accomplish. Doolittle's reputation for innovation and calculated risk-taking had made him legendary among aviators who understood that progress often required defying conventional wisdom. His proposal to launch twin-engine bombers from an aircraft carrier struck many experts as suicidal. Yet the desperate circumstances of early 1942 demanded solutions that transcended normal operational parameters. The mathematics were unforgiving. Fully loaded Mitchell bombers weighed nearly 15 tons each, requiring runways that measured 5 times longer than a carrier's flight deck. Success would depend entirely on modifications, training, and the skill of pilots willing to attempt what their instruction manuals declared impossible. As winter gave way to spring in 1942, the secret training for what would become known as the Doolittle Raid intensified at Eglin Field in Florida, where selected crews practiced the seemingly impossible task of launching heavily loaded bombers from simulated carrier decks. Maddox and his crew quickly distinguished themselves among the volunteers who had answered Doolittle's call for experienced medium bomber pilots willing to undertake an unnamed mission of extraordinary danger. The training regimen pushed both men and machines to their absolute limits, with takeoff distances shortened progressively until pilots could lift their aircraft off runways barely longer than a football field. Each practice session brought new challenges and innovations as crews learned to maximize every advantage that physics and engineering could provide. Fuel loads were calculated to the gallon, ammunition reduced to essential rounds, and unnecessary equipment stripped away to save precious pounds that might mean the difference between success and failure. Maddox's natural feel for aircraft served him well during these grueling weeks as he developed techniques for using wind patterns and propeller pitch to extract maximum performance from his modified Mitchell. His crew consisted of navigator Lysander Pierce, a former mathematics professor from Oregon whose ability to calculate courses by dead reckoning bordered on supernatural, Bombardier Caspian Torres, a former crop duster from California who could place bombs with surgical precision, and gunners Thaddeus Crane and Phineas Hawthorne, both farm boys from the Midwest who understood the mechanical sympathies that kept complex machines functioning under impossible stress. Together they formed a tight unit bound by shared risk and mutual dependence, knowing that their survival would require perfect coordination under circumstances that had never been attempted in the history of warfare. The secrecy surrounding their mission added another layer of psychological pressure, as none of the crews knew their ultimate destination or the nature of targets they would be expected to attack. Rumors circulated constantly among the volunteers, with speculation ranging from attacks on German submarine bases to raids against Japanese installations in the Philippines. What they did know was that their training emphasized long-range navigation over hostile territory and the ability to operate independently without support or possibility of rescue. As their departure date approached, each crew member wrote letters to family members that would only be delivered if they failed to return, a sobering reminder that they were volunteering for a mission that might require the ultimate sacrifice. The morning of April 2, 1942, brought unexpected orders as the 16 modified B-25 bombers were loaded aboard the USS Hornet at Alameda Naval Air Station in California, their wings folding carefully to fit within the confines of the carrier's hangar deck. The sight of Army bombers aboard a Navy vessel drew curious stares from dock workers and sailors who understood that something unprecedented was taking shape before their eyes. Security remained tight, but the obvious implications of such preparations sent ripples of excitement and apprehension throughout the fleet personnel who would support this daring venture. Maddox supervised the careful securing of his aircraft, knowing that the Pacific crossing would subject every bolt and rivet to stresses that might compromise their mission before it began. The Hornet's crew worked with remarkable efficiency to accommodate their unusual cargo, modifying storage areas and flight procedures to handle aircraft that had never been designed for carrier operations. As the task force departed San Francisco Bay, heading into the gray expanse of the Pacific Ocean, an atmosphere of controlled tension settled over the ship. Daily briefings revealed additional details about their target, confirming what many had already suspected. They were bound for Japan itself, carrying the war to the enemy's heartland for the first time since the conflict began. The strategic implications were staggering, yet the tactical challenges remained formidable as weather reports indicated deteriorating conditions along their planned route. Navigator Pierce spent hours reviewing meteorological data and calculating alternate courses that might provide the wind patterns necessary for successful takeoff from the carrier's abbreviated flight deck. Meanwhile, Bombardier Torres studied intelligence photographs of potential targets, memorizing landmarks and defensive positions that might determine the success or failure of their attack. The entire crew understood that they were participating in a mission that would either demonstrate American resolve and capability or result in their capture or death thousands of miles from home. Each day of the voyage brought them closer to a point of no return where hesitation or error would prove fatal, not only to themselves, but potentially to the broader war effort that depended on their success. The pre-dawn hours of April 18, 1942, found the task force still 200 miles farther from Japan than planned, forced to launch early after encountering enemy patrol vessels that threatened to compromise their approach. The discovery of Japanese picket boats created an immediate crisis that transformed their carefully calculated mission parameters into a desperate race against time and geography. Admiral Halsey's decision to launch immediately, despite the increased distance to target, placed enormous additional stress on crews who had trained for months to execute their mission under specific conditions that no longer applied. Maddox gathered his crew in the cramped quarters beneath the Hornet's flight deck, as klaxons sounded general quarters and the carrier turned into the wind to provide maximum assistance for the impossible takeoffs ahead. The mathematics of their situation had become even more unforgiving, with fuel margins reduced to virtually nothing and navigation requiring precision that left no room for error or delay. Pierce spread his charts across the narrow table, recalculating courses and fuel consumption rates, while Torres checked his bomb sight calibration for the 100th time. The tension in their small space was palpable as each man contemplated the increased risks that now accompanied their already dangerous mission. Outside, deck crews worked frantically to position the first bomber for takeoff, knowing that every minute of delay increased the likelihood of discovery by Japanese forces that would certainly scramble interceptors to protect their homeland. The sound of engines warming up reverberated through the ship's steel hull as pilots began their final preparations, checking instruments and running through mental checklists that had been refined during weeks of intensive training. Maddox felt the familiar surge of adrenaline that accompanied moments of supreme challenge, when training and instinct would determine whether impossible goals could be achieved through skill and determination. His hands moved automatically through the startup sequence as his mind focused on the precise timing and coordination required to lift 26,000 pounds of aircraft and ordnance off a deck that provided barely half the distance normally required for such an operation. The radio crackled with terse communications between the flight deck and bridge as final weather observations confirmed marginal conditions that would test every aspect of their preparation and resolve. Lieutenant Colonel Doolittle's bomber lurched forward first, its engines straining against maximum power as the carrier pitched through heavy swells that made precise timing even more critical than anticipated. The sight of the lead aircraft clearing the deck by mere feet sent waves of both relief and apprehension through the crews waiting their turn to attempt the same impossible feat. Each successive takeoff built confidence while demonstrating the narrow margin between success and catastrophic failure that defined their entire enterprise. Maddox watched through a porthole as bomber after bomber managed to claw into the gray morning sky, their heavily loaded aircraft struggling to gain altitude in the turbulent air surrounding the task force. The deck crew worked with mechanical precision despite the obvious danger, positioning each aircraft and coordinating the launch sequence with split-second timing that left no margin for hesitation or error. When his turn arrived, Maddox felt the familiar sensation of time slowing as his awareness focused entirely on the critical moments ahead. His crew had taken their positions, each man ready to perform his assigned duties with the precision that their survival demanded. Navigator Pierce confirmed their course settings one final time, while Bombardier Torres secured his equipment for the violent acceleration that would either launch them toward Japan or end their mission in disaster. The deck officer's raised flag commanded Maddox's complete attention as he advanced his throttles to maximum power, feeling the Mitchell's twin engines build to a roar that seemed to shake the entire carrier. The flag dropped with theatrical finality, and Maddox released his brakes, committing himself and his crew to forces beyond their control. The aircraft surged forward with surprising acceleration as the carrier's deck crew had positioned them at the precise moment when the ship's upward motion through the swells would provide maximum assistance. The sensation of flying off the deck edge into empty space above the Pacific Ocean defied every instinct developed during years of conventional flying, yet their modified bomber responded as predicted, gaining just enough altitude to clear the waves and begin climbing toward their assigned cruising altitude. Behind them, the remaining bombers continued their launches with mechanical precision, each crew trusting in preparation and skill to overcome the fundamental impossibility of their situation. The flight toward Japan stretched across 6 hours of navigational precision that tested every aspect of their training and preparation. Pierce's calculations proved accurate as they encountered the predicted headwinds that would consume precious fuel while pushing them slightly off their planned course. The formation of 16 bombers gradually spread across miles of empty ocean as individual pilots adjusted their routes to compensate for varying wind conditions and mechanical differences between aircraft. Radio silence prevented communication between the bombers, leaving each crew isolated with their own challenges and concerns as they crossed the vast expanse of the Pacific toward their historic rendezvous with destiny. Maddox maintained precise engine settings that balanced fuel consumption against the need to reach their target with sufficient reserves for the planned escape to China. His crew performed their duties with quiet efficiency, monitoring instruments and calculating updates to their navigation while the Pacific passed endlessly beneath their wings. The weather deteriorated gradually as they approached the Japanese coast, with cloud cover that would provide concealment, but also complicate navigation during the crucial bombing runs that justified all their risks and preparation. Torres prepared his bomb sight and reviewed his target assignments, knowing that their success would be measured not only by their survival, but by the accuracy of their attacks on the industrial and military installations that supported Japan's war effort. The psychological impact of their raid would depend partly on hitting targets that demonstrated American capability to strike precise objectives despite the enormous distances and defenses that protected the Japanese homeland. As the hours passed, each crew member dealt with the mounting tension of approaching enemy territory while maintaining the focused concentration necessary for mission success. Their fuel gauges showed consumption rates that matched Pierce's calculations almost exactly, confirming that their training and modifications had prepared them adequately for the unprecedented challenges they faced. The sight of the Japanese coastline emerging through the haze marked the beginning of the most dangerous phase of their mission, when they would be exposed to enemy defenses while completing attacks that had never before been attempted by American forces. The Japanese mainland appeared through scattered clouds as a patchwork of green fields and industrial installations that seemed deceptively peaceful in the afternoon sunlight. Maddox reduced altitude to avoid detection by radar installations that intelligence reports had indicated might exist along the coast, though the exact capabilities of Japanese early warning systems remained uncertain. His bomber approached Tokyo from an unexpected direction, taking advantage of terrain features and weather patterns to minimize their exposure to defensive fire from the anti-aircraft batteries that certainly protected such vital targets. The sight of the imperial capital spread below them carried enormous symbolic significance as they became the first American airmen to penetrate the heart of the Japanese Empire since the war began. Torres acquired their assigned targets through his bomb sight, identifying the industrial facilities that represented key components of Japan's military production capability. The coordination required for their bombing run demanded perfect timing, as Maddox adjusted his approach to provide the stable platform necessary for accurate bomb release while maintaining speed sufficient to escape the defensive fire that would certainly follow their attack. The city below showed no signs of alarm or preparation for attack, suggesting that their approach had achieved complete surprise despite the enormous risks involved in reaching this moment. Japanese civilians went about their daily routines completely unaware that American bombers were about to deliver a message that would transform their understanding of the war's scope and their homeland's vulnerability. The anti-aircraft fire that erupted around them seemed sporadic and poorly coordinated, confirming intelligence estimates that Tokyo's defenses had been designed primarily to repel attacks by short-range aircraft operating from nearby bases. Torres released their bombs with practiced precision, watching through his bomb sight as the explosives fell toward their intended targets, while Maddox banked sharply to begin their escape toward the coast. The sight of explosions erupting among Tokyo's industrial districts marked the successful completion of their primary mission, though their survival still depended on escaping Japanese airspace and reaching the Chinese coast with their remaining fuel reserves. Behind them, smoke columns rose from multiple locations as the other bombers in their formation completed their own attacks with similar precision and success. The escape flight toward China tested their endurance and navigation skills as fuel consumption calculations became critical to their survival over the 600 miles of hostile territory that separated them from friendly forces. Pierce monitored their progress against his charts while calculating alternative landing sites that might provide refuge if their fuel ran low before reaching their intended destination. The weather continued to deteriorate as they flew westward, with cloud cover that provided concealment, but also made navigation more difficult during the critical hours when precision might determine their fate. Japanese fighter aircraft appeared intermittently through the clouds, but the enemy pilots seemed unprepared for the speed and altitude of the American bombers, allowing most crews to evade interception through superior tactics and equipment. Maddox pushed his engines to cruise settings that balanced speed against fuel consumption while maintaining course toward the Chinese airfields that represented their only hope for survival. The radio remained silent as planned, preventing the Japanese from tracking their escape routes, while leaving each crew to navigate independently toward safety. Hours passed in tense concentration as fuel gauges showed steadily decreasing reserves that would soon force critical decisions about their final destination. The Chinese coast appeared through the gathering dusk as a welcome sight that represented the successful completion of the most audacious bombing raid in aviation history. However, their problems were far from over as weather and fuel shortages forced several crews to consider emergency landings or bailouts over territory that might or might not be controlled by friendly forces. Maddox's crew prepared for the possibility of abandoning their aircraft as their fuel reserves reached minimum levels that would not permit reaching their assigned airfield. The decision to crash land or bail out over unfamiliar territory represented the final test of their training and courage as they committed themselves to whatever fate awaited them in the darkness ahead. Their successful attack on Tokyo had already changed history, but their personal survival remained uncertain as they descended toward the Chinese mainland with engines sputtering from fuel starvation. The aftermath of the Doolittle raid reverberated throughout both the American and Japanese leadership, as the strategic implications of the successful attack became clear to military planners on both sides of the Pacific. Maddox and most of his fellow raiders eventually reached safety through the assistance of Chinese guerrilla forces and American intelligence networks that helped them evade capture during the dangerous weeks following their historic mission. The psychological impact of striking Tokyo exceeded even the most optimistic projections as Japanese confidence in their homeland's invulnerability suffered a devastating blow that influenced strategic decisions for the remainder of the war. Emperor Hirohito's personal reaction to the bombing reportedly included shock that American aircraft could penetrate so deeply into the Japanese defensive perimeter, forcing a reassessment of military priorities that had assumed the homeland would remain secure. The Japanese military response included the immediate strengthening of air defenses around major cities and the recall of fighter squadrons from forward positions to protect against future attacks that might follow the same pattern. More significantly, the raid influenced Japanese strategic thinking about the necessity of expanding their defensive perimeter to prevent similar attacks, contributing to decisions that would ultimately lead to the disastrous defeat at the Battle of Midway. Admiral Yamamoto's determination to force a decisive naval battle stemmed partly from his recognition that Japan's position would become increasingly untenable if American forces could strike the homeland with impunity. The propaganda value of the raid for American morale proved equally significant as newspapers and radio broadcasts celebrated the first successful retaliation against Japan since Pearl Harbor. President Roosevelt's cryptic announcement that the bombers had taken off from Shangri-La captured the public imagination while maintaining operational security about the true nature of their achievement. Maddox returned to the United States as part of a group of survivors who were initially sworn to secrecy about their participation in the raid, though their story would eventually become one of the most celebrated episodes in American military history. His post-war career included continued service as a test pilot and aviation instructor, sharing his experience with the next generation of airmen who would benefit from the innovations and techniques developed during those crucial weeks of training and combat. The technical innovations pioneered during the Doolittle raid influenced aircraft design and carrier operations for decades after the war ended, with military engineers studying every aspect of the mission to understand how conventional limitations had been overcome through modification and training. The successful launch of twin-engine bombers from aircraft carriers demonstrated possibilities that had previously been dismissed as impossible, leading to new concepts for power projection that would shape naval aviation doctrine throughout the Cold War era. Maddox's detailed reports on aircraft performance under extreme conditions contributed to improvements in engine design and structural modifications that made subsequent operations safer and more effective. The raid also proved the value of specialized training and crew selection in accomplishing missions that exceeded normal operational parameters, establishing principles that would guide special operations development in future conflicts. Letters from Chinese civilians who witnessed the bombing attacks revealed the enormous boost to Allied morale throughout occupied territories, where news of American aircraft over Tokyo spread rapidly despite Japanese attempts at censorship. The symbolic significance of the raid continued to resonate years after the war ended, with survivors like Maddox frequently invited to speak at military academies and aviation schools where their experience provided inspiration for new generations of airmen. The engineering challenges overcome during the mission contributed to advances in aircraft carrier design and deck procedures that enhanced the Navy's ability to conduct operations at unprecedented ranges from friendly bases. Intelligence reports captured after the war revealed the extent to which the raid had disrupted Japanese planning and forced the diversion of resources to homeland defense that might otherwise have been deployed against American forces in the Pacific. The psychological warfare aspect of the mission proved as valuable as its tactical achievements, demonstrating that innovative thinking and calculated risk-taking could overcome seemingly insurmountable obstacles through careful preparation and exceptional skill. Maddox often reflected that their success depended not on superior technology or overwhelming force, but on the willingness to attempt something that conventional wisdom declared impossible, trusting in training and determination to achieve objectives that changed the course of history. The legacy of April 18, 1942, extends far beyond the immediate tactical results of 16 bombers attacking Japanese cities, encompassing a transformation in strategic thinking that recognized the power of innovation to overcome traditional limitations. The raid demonstrated that distance and defensive barriers could be neutralized by creative approaches that utilized existing technology in unprecedented ways, establishing principles that would guide military planning throughout the remainder of the 20th century. Maddox and his fellow raiders proved that individual skill and courage could accomplish objectives that seemed impossible to achieve through conventional methods, inspiring countless subsequent operations that pushed the boundaries of what military forces could accomplish under extraordinary circumstances. The mission's success stemmed from the willingness to challenge fundamental assumptions about aircraft capabilities and operational procedures, developing solutions that required months of preparation and training to execute safely. The psychological impact of demonstrating that Japan's homeland could be reached and attacked influenced both American strategy and Japanese defensive planning in ways that contributed significantly to the ultimate Allied victory in the Pacific War. Modern military historians continue to study the Doolittle Raid as an example of how innovative thinking and exceptional execution can achieve strategic objectives that far exceed the tactical scope of the operation itself. The courage displayed by airmen who volunteered for a mission they knew might cost their lives represents the highest traditions of military service and personal sacrifice in defense of democratic values and human freedom. Their story reminds us that individual decisions can change the course of history when brave men and women choose to act beyond the boundaries of conventional wisdom and accepted limitations. In an era when global challenges seem to require solutions that transcend traditional approaches, the example of those who dared to launch bombers from aircraft carriers offers inspiration for anyone willing to pursue seemingly impossible goals through careful preparation and unwavering determination. Would you have had the courage to volunteer for a mission that defied every principle of safe aviation, of trusting in training and innovation to achieve objectives that could change the course of history? Comment below and share this story so others can learn how 16 crews proved that the impossible becomes possible when courage meets innovation. And remember that the spirit of those who carried the war to Japan's doorstep continues to inspire all who refuse to accept that vital objectives cannot be achieved simply because they have never been attempted before.